All right, we're joined by Mike Benz today. Mike is very close to a topic that we discuss very often here, which is can you say anything online anymore? And Mike, besides working with Ben Carson, you also did cyber. What's the right term? Cyber work,
You
cyber.
know, that's a great question because the same question was in the office of the State Department at the time. Yes, because I mean, really, we just call it cyber at this point because originally there was only really cybersecurity, but then there's all the sort of commercial aspects of the internet, and then there's the speech and sort of social media aspect of the internet. So it's basically the cyber. I just technically it was international relations and information technology, but it just went by the name the cyber desk at the State Department. And then I was at the White House as a speechwriter for President Trump, and I was a tech lawyer before that.
Okay. To fast forward, and then we're going to go back in time for a second. You are the executive director for the Foundation for Freedom Online. Can you tell us a little bit about how your background that you just described brought you to the point where you wanted to start this organization, and what's the goal?
Yeah, so the goal of our organization at Foundation for Freedom Online is to restore the golden age of the internet when you were basically free to be yourself, to have a voice on social media, relatively unfettered, to buy and sell goods, relatively unfettered. Essentially, the internet as it existed from essentially 1991 to 2016, after which there was the onset of what we term the censorship industry, which is this whole of society censorship infrastructure and apparatus spanning the government, the private sector platforms, these civil society censorship mercenary firm organizations, and the fact checker blob. So basically, all of that was created between 2016 and present day. I worked at the cyber desk of the State Department doing essentially US foreign policy connected to the internet, and also had been studying and working through the sort of mapping censorship issues long before that. My job with the federal government involved essentially free speech diplomacy. It was very natural after that to want to continue that work in a civil society capacity. So we created Foundation for Freedom Online to basically continue the mission of advocating free speech on the internet.
Okay. Were there specific concerns that you came across? Because for a lot of us, it seems, and maybe it's just because I only started getting onto YouTube in a world of conversation that gets censored, recently. So maybe it's not a new thing. I was doing Airstream renovation, so nobody cared. And now I talk to, it started with doctors during COVID, for instance. And that was when I started getting suspended and everything. But from your perspective, is this something that has been building over time, or it just escalated recently, or it's something very new? I mean, how do you see the problem?
Well, it started after the 2016 US presidential election. I mean, technically, it started a little bit earlier than that, if you want to get technical about NATO's role and, the sort of 2014 to 2016 period where the government started laying down this initial censorship infrastructure around the technology to do it and the connections within the platforms to other outside organizations to be able to make it happen. But basically, it started after the 2016 election because the US, UK, Brussels foreign policy establishment basically decided that social media was allowing elections and democratic outcomes around the world to get out of their control, essentially a uniparty control system that had existed from Truman to Trump, mostly mediated by the fact that mainstream media from the 1940s until the 2010s was often acting as a cutout of elite institutions when when regular civilians could grow YouTube channels or Twitter accounts larger than the New York Times or larger than traditional media organs. It allowed elections to tilt towards what they call populism. And so, in 2016, there was a Philippines election that went the wrong way from the State Department wanted. There was the Brexit referendum that went the wrong way from what the State Department wanted. There was the Trump election, which went the wrong way from what the State Department wanted. And then in 2017, 2018, you had the Bolsonaro election in Brazil. You had the Italian election with Salvini in Italy. You had Marine Le Pen coming within a hairbreadth of the presidency in France. Basically, all around the world, the people who are used to winning elections stopped winning them. Ideas started to become politically popular that were not allowed to, and so they shut down the internet to stop all that.
Okay. Um, when it comes to what we have now, because I remember one of the conversations that we were talking about during the Trump administration was Section 230, and should Section 230 be rewritten? I know there were concerns actually even from people in the open and free internet world that messing with Section 230 would actually make things worse. So it wasn't necessarily just divided among people who were like pro censorship versus anti censorship. Even in the anti censorship world, there are people who said Section 230 should be left as is. And that it was really less so the problem with Section 230 and more so the problem with the way that the government was working with the tech companies. Regardless, what do you think about Section 230? And maybe could you explain to people what it is before you get into your opinion? Okay.
Yeah, so Section 230 refers to Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which is basically a law that allowed large internet platforms to be the unique thing they are online that distinguishes them from a brick and mortar. So if there is a false and defamatory comment that the New York Times publishes, you can sue them for defamation. If the New York Times publishes that false and defamatory statement on Twitter, you can't just sue Twitter just because they're a host of that content, because one of them is a platform, Twitter. The publisher of the content, however, would be the New York Times. This distinction between a neutral platform and an opinionated publisher is the grounds for what Section 230 provides. It's called a safe harbor. It's basically a liability protection shield that allows large platforms to operate the scale they do because they are neutral. That is, they're not picking winners. They're not writing the op-eds themselves. Now, the reason Section 230 became sort of eligible for appeal, if you will, politically from mostly from conservatives after the 2016 election was because the platforms started to act like publishers. That is, they started to curate information as a publisher would. They started publishing fact checks as if they were basically New York Times style opinions. In dozens of ways, they started to act like the publishers of information themselves, and therefore, under Section 230, they should lose their liability shield. The issue is if they did that, then they would essentially go bankrupt because every single person in the world would have a claim against them for something. And so it was never acted on because it would have collapsed the Dow. It would have collapsed these U.S. national champions in the tech space. It's been punted on for eternity. And frankly, I personally don't have a problem with that because I think, as you mentioned before, Section 230 is kind of one of these Chinese finger traps that you try to put your fingers into it and you can't get them out. There's no real way that I have seen, and I've sat in on dozens of these, strategy sessions for how to creatively restructure Section 230 to achieve an anti-censorship end. I don't find it to be a workable solution, and there's so much else that can be done from the government side, between creating a private right of action for censorship for censored individuals at the state level, which Florida and Texas have done through smart regulation from Congress on what platforms might be limited from doing on the censorship side, from eliminating government funding from key agencies like the National Science Foundation, the Pentagon, the State Department, HHS, FBI, and DHS. There's a million, there's a million things you can do. I think Section 230 was always a pipe dream. It was a Babe Ruth home run swing that was a cope, frankly, I think, for people to not have to think too deeply about the issue, because one big magic trick would make all of the problems go away. But the fact is that's the opposite of the philosophy we need. It's trench warfare. You need to go after every single aspect of the censorship industry, go after its revenues, go after it from the regulatory side, go after it from the judicial side, go at it from the policy side, legislatively, and go after it from the media side. But that takes a lot of work. And until recently, not a lot of people were even educated enough to even do the work, even if they wanted to.
Okay. Mike, before we go any farther, I just got to tell people about some amazing wine, my extremist altitude wine. I tell people if you want to be an extremist, but you don't want to go to federal prison, it's a great way to dip your toes into it. I mean, you could dip your toes into wine if you want. I don't recommend it. It's high quality, so I'd drink it if I were you. But, go to AllisonWinePromo.com. You get 50% off the wine and 50% off shipping. It's all from Argentina. These are amazing Malbecs. They're my favorite ever. I drank high altitude Malbecs from Argentina before they were even a sponsor. They heard me talking about it, and they were like, hey, would you like to sell our wine because you already drink it anyway? And so anyway, that's how the love match was made. So go support my work and support Bronner Wine. They never tell me who I can talk to or what I have to say or anything like that. And they've been with me from the beginning. And it's just plain good wine. It's a great way to get grandma drunk, so she forgets that you unfriended her during COVID or whatever else happened. Okay, AllisonWinePromo.com. Also, if you go to TwinEngineCoffee.com/Allison, you can get some high altitude coffees for your hangover the next day. These are USDA certified organic. They're light roast, dark roast. There's also a tea if you're a tea drinker. And if you go to Locals, you can be on my editorial board. You put questions in ahead of time for interviews. alsamara.locals.com. Like I said, $5 a month. You get to go one-on-one with the most censored people on the internet. I think it's a great value. You also get an extra show per week. Every week, my friend Bill Doris used to be in TV News 2, and I do an exclusive show for supporters. Focus on media analysis and all that good stuff. So we'll take questions from Mike over there in a second. And Mike, I forgot to tell you, I have a 1-year-old who was supposed to sleep through the show, but he just woke up. So I'm going to go get him, but I'm going to ask you a question where I go and you can just answer it.
Gotcha.
Actually, I'll go over to, there was a couple related to your time working under the Trump administration. So let's throw you this. This is from Locals again. Okay, it seems to be clearly evident the government is trying to control or influence people through social media. Do they think it's for the better good or just an agenda that will benefit them financially and establish power for them? And then also, when writing a speech for President Trump, was it often a guideline knowing he was going to ad-lib? Also, did he make notations to add or delete things? Last, was writing his speeches fun or challenging? Can you remember all those, or do you want me to leave it up on the screen?
I'll have to peer into it to see
Let me
it.
see if I can
if
make
you leave
it
it
big.
up on screen, if you make it a little bigger, that'll be a little easier. But okay. Sounds
okay,
good.
I'm gonna mute myself. I'll be right back with the kid.
All right, cool. All right, I got you. I'll run it. I got you. Live from the Allison Morris Show. Okay, so it seems to be clearly evident the government is trying to control or influence people through social media. Fact check, true. Do they think it's for the better good or just an agenda that will benefit them financially and establish power for themselves? Well, so this is kind of this is one of these things where I would divide up what you mean by government there. So you got basically 3 different categories. Let's just call them 2 different categories of government here. You've got sort of government employees who are often career professionals within government, although they can rotate like a revolving door into outside institutions. And then you have donors and drafters off of government policy. So, for example, in the censorship industry, you have government censorship institutions like the Department of Homeland Security's censorship subagency called CISA, or you have the Pentagon doing a lot of censoring. You have the State Department doing a lot of censoring. You have the National Science Foundation funding a lot of the censorship. So you've got careers at those government institutions who have a vested interest in censoring content. But then you also have the people who basically install those government operatives who benefit from. So a great example of this is an institution like the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council is one of the apex predator heavyweights of the censorship industry. They are technically a outside think tank, is what they call themselves. They call themselves basically NATO's think tank, representing the civil society consensus of the Western military alliance. So the Pentagon, the UK Ministry of Defense, the US State Department, the CIA, the UK Foreign Office, MI6, Brussels, as well as the French, Italian, Spanish, all of the equivalents of that throughout all of NATO. Now, the Atlantic Council is filled with and constantly coordinates with government agencies on censorship issues and censorship policies and censorship pressure. But the Atlantic Council is funded by federal government agencies like the Pentagon, the State Department, and CIA cutouts like the National Endowment for Democracy, but it's also funded by major energy companies and by major military contractors who have a vested interest in the censorship policies. So the censorship policies are not necessarily set, government officials are not necessarily pursuing censorship policies because they personally profit from them in any direct sense. Although they do profit in the sense that it props up their career because they are serving their sponsors in the sort of corporate world outside, or in the world of these stakeholders outside of government. So I hope this is coming across clearly. But for example, a lot of the energy companies that sponsor the Atlantic Council were behind a play for Ukraine to pry Russia's Gazprom off of the European energy market and replace that with Chevron, Shell, Exxon, Halliburton, and the country of Ukraine signed multi-billion-dollar natural gas deals with all of those companies. Those companies then paid the Atlantic Council. The Atlantic Council then put pressure on government officials to install censorship regimes across all of Europe against all of the right-wing populist parties in Europe who were supportive of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. Parties like the Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, or Marine Le Pen's National Rally Party in France, or the Vox Party in Spain. So all of them got politically censored as right-wing conservative groups, but this was basically just a proxy censorship policy of the stakeholders in the energy and military sphere, putting their thumb on the government, who in turn puts their thumb on the private sector. And then, Allison, there's a question here about what it was like writing a speech for Trump. There's a couple of these, so I'm just going to condense it into one funny analogy.
Okay.
Because it sort of gets to the Section 230 thing. So when I was at the White House, there was a Trump was tweeting in all caps, repeal Section 230, and I'm sitting here like pounding my head like his heart's in the right place, but that's not there's much more work we have to do. That's not going to solve the issue. This is like June 2020. I'm writing a speech on it was a 27 state attorney generals speech on censorship, and I'd sort of fought to get censorship on the agenda because they wanted to preserve this 50 state attorney general thing. The Democrats didn't want the president to talk about censorship. I really fought for it. I write this beautiful speech with all of the empirical data and all of the accounts, and the whole network around it that was causing this to happen and what we should do about it. The president gets about a paragraph into it, looks up and goes, because he was sitting down for this, so there was no teleprompter, it's printed out. He looks up, he says, everyone talks about censorship like it's such a big deal, but let them try. They tried to stop me in 2016, didn't work then, won't work now. And I'm sitting here like, oh my God, I spent 2 weeks fighting for this. I spent a week crafting this. It was my finest Mona Lisa, like piece of rhetorical artwork. And and sometimes it's like that. Sometimes but that's part of his charm is his authenticity. I think at the time he did not appreciate the threat that the censorship industry posed. He had no idea how deep it went, how much damage it was ultimately going to do to him, because this was before he ended up getting mass fact checked, and then you couldn't even click on his tweets for a couple months in September, October. And then finally, he was just taken completely off the platform. So June was, by that point, all of his followers were getting throttled, but it hadn't really affected him personally yet. So I think when he saw that speech, it didn't, he decided to go in a different direction. But on other matters, it was, you never know what you're going to get, but that's also part of his charm.
Okay. I'm sorry I missed the first part of it. It sounded like it was an interesting answer. Okay. DMC, why do University of Pennsylvania graduates rarely call out the overwhelming Roman Catholic influence in media? And what is your religious upbringing? And this is in relation to, or in regards to, Jack, don't touch that, the NBC article we're not discussing because it may result in legal action. You've asked not to discuss it. So we're going to move from that. But do you mind answering that question about, if you have any answer to it?
Roman Catholic influence? Is that, that's the... This is sort of outside of my censorship wheelhouse, but I'll leave that to the other commentary. I don't think I'm really the leading expert on that topic.
Okay, what is your religious upbringing?
I'm Jewish.
Okay. All right. Um, Please ask Mr. Benz his critical thought to describe in detail his response to research by Robert Epstein proving that Google has been socially engineering the public, including the manipulation of elections. Um, as an insider, I can only assume that Benz is aware of this large-scale detective work by Robert Epstein. Has been interviewed on multiple independent media channels. Jimmy Dore, Kim Iverson. Are you familiar?
Yeah, they're doing what they're supposed to do. I mean, I don't mean that from a normative standpoint, but Google is a CIA project. I mean, this. So, I mean, let me explain what I mean by that. So, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, the two founders of Google, they basically started off as Stanford graduate students, basically working on the computer science backbone of Google. It was called, I think, Backpage was the name of the Google predecessor, and the search engine, basically tools that they developed were came out of this DARPA grant that they had at Stanford. DARPA's is the Pentagon's Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. It's basically the futuristic tech development for America's war machine, the Pentagon. And the Pentagon was mediating a project at the time called the Massive Digital Data Systems Project, which was a joint project of the NSA and the CIA. The NSA and the CIA, when the internet went private in 1991, because the internet itself was a DARPA project in the 1960s, it was created as a means to be able to digitize primarily social science information so that the US could successfully wage counterinsurgency proxy wars around the globe at the time we were building our empire. It remained a government project for the first 30 years of its existence, from the 1960s to 1991. In 1991, DARPA turns it over to the National Science Foundation, who rolls it out to the universities, who make it go public with the World Wide Web. Very quickly, Web 1.0, with its blogs and forums, became a centralization point for political activism around the world in countries of interest to the U.S. State Department and intelligence community. By 1995, it had been identified that birds of a feather were flocking together politically, and the CIA and the NSA wanted an ability to track birds of a feather as they flock together online. And so they gave money to the two founders of Google, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, for them to develop basically search engine and traffic routing and monitoring capacities that would be useful for the intelligence services. That's what the DARPA grant was. They then turned that into a private company, but they were in league with the U.S. government every step of the way. The first year they went public, I think 2003 or 2004, they became a military contractor. The only reason Google was able to develop Google Maps was because they bought the Keyhole satellite technology software from the Central Intelligence Agency itself. Literally the CIA sold them the capacity to even do Google Maps. So Google has a branch called Google Jigsaw, which is basically their CIA branch, which is myopically obsessed with controlling elections around the world. And what Robert Epstein discovered is not some happy accident beneficial to the Democrats. It's much bigger than that. This is the uniparty foreign policy blob establishment that has existed in this country since at least the 1940s, manifest online.
Okay, one in from. Oh, did I lose him? Wait, I'm back. I think I froze. That was my fault. Did I freeze?
Just for a sec.
Okay, good. Okay, where was this? It was about where would Cambridge Analytica's coders seek employment these days? Wells Mortensen asks.
Oh my God, Google Jigsaw, what we just talked about. I mean, it's but any number of ones. The Atlantic Council's Digital Forensics Research Lab. They'd go to Graphica. They'd go to the Stanford Internet Observatory. If you go to my foundation's website, foundationfreedomonline.com, or if you just follow me on Twitter at Mike Ben Cyber, you'll be able to answer that question very quickly, because I and my team post about this every day, all the different censorship mercenary firm institutions that Cambridge Analytica computational data science people feed directly into.
How does your organization differ from EFF, the Electronic Frontier Foundation?
We don't serve the national security state. We don't serve the government. It's really funny. When I created Foundation for Freedom Online, I was I I had a couple other candidate names because I was afraid if I put the word freedom in it, people would think that we were not independent and that we were serving the federal government rather than the people who vote for the government. Because internet freedom was a meme of the national security state, of the Pentagon, the State Department, and the intelligence services. The US government created all the major freedom technologies, VPNs to hide your IP address, end-to-end encrypted chat to evade government surveillance of text messages, Tor for the dark web. All of this stuff was created by DARPA and by CIA, NSA projects so that we could provide dissident groups abroad with free speech when we wanted to topple foreign governments. So you had all these NGOs that were all created in the 1990s and the early 2000s to advance internet free speech, but they were really just advancing basically political dissident groups being backed by the CIA or the State Department. So when the CIA and the State Department turned towards internet censorship instead of internet freedom, because dissident groups were winning elections in places that they weren't supposed to, all of those NGOs started advocating censorship in various forms. The freedom and democracy and all these terms that were initially associated with free speech began to be associated with a sort of Karl Popovian, if you will, paradox of tolerance, if you will. There's if you're familiar, George Soros is big on this whole thing, and so are many sort of Marxist-Leninist types, that there's a sort of paradox of tolerance. In a tolerant society must be intolerant of the intolerant. So in a weird way, you must be intolerant to be tolerant. Well, there's a similar parallel with the censorship industry, which is that it used to be all about tolerance, if you will. It used to be all be about free speech, but now they have, as they say, we need censorship to preserve free speech. We need censorship to preserve democracy. And so all of these NGOs, like, frankly, I'm saying this if I'm being too cryptic, I think EFF and many other organizations that were supposed to fight for free speech have completely failed in that mission and have been part of the problem. I'm not speaking entirely about the organization as it is, but certainly there are critical enough. EFF should have been out there protecting us. The moment this stuff was out there, I shouldn't have even had to have created FFO. EFF should have been doing all this stuff. They weren't, and it beggars the question why. And maybe that's a larger question beyond the scope, but that's the answer.
Okay. Question for Mr. Benz, again from Wells Mortensen. A month ago, you produced a video message for Elon Musk illuminating German party AFD's plights in light of new LNG contracts. What then is your take on future of Turkstream versus EastMed routes supplying nat gas to EU?
Yeah, so this sort of gets into what we were talking about before. I think, Allison, you were in the other room, but I mentioned that the State Department, our intelligence services, and the censorship industry have really been focused on stopping the rise of this right-wing populist political party in Germany called AfD, who is running on a platform of supplying cheap Russian gas for the German working class. In terms of Turkstream and things like that, it's very difficult right now because there's so much happening with the Russia-Ukraine war, and now with the Israel-Iran proxy war, and the sort of Qatar issues there. Turkey plays a very. I have not been able to place a geopolitical predicted bet, if you will, with any level of confidence around what Turkey will do. So Erdogan is a notorious geopolitical tap dancer who sort of tells you what you want to hear, and then tells the other guy what they want to hear, and then does that to the 20 other world leaders until nobody knows what he's going to do next. There's a lot of these, because of how Turkey is situated um, around these pipelines, I just don't know the direction to be able to bet on that. What I would say though is it depends. A lot of this depends on what happens in the 2024 election here. Right now, the Biden administration is effectively doing an Iran deal without signing one, operating through this essentially Chinese energy companies who are evading sanctions, and then partnering with those Chinese companies to sort of get around a ban on Iranian natural gas. If the Biden administration can completely eliminate political opposition, they will open up Iranian gas, and that will set the stage for what the pipeline politics are. If Trump ends up somehow winning the 2024 election, I suspect all of this will shut completely. The first thing Trump did in office when he won in 2016, the very first thing he did, day one, was get rid of the Iran nuclear deal. If he were to do that in this situation, it would radically change the way energy politics works in the Middle East. Frankly, I think that's why they're so hell-bent on stopping.
Okay. Magpie asks, should everyone go back to flip phones and avoid or eschew social media entirely? Will Google get broken up as a monopoly?
Google will not get broken up as a monopoly. Flip phones won't save you. I mean, basically, if it becomes effective, it will be targeted. So, if you're ineffective at flip phones, then yeah, go back to that. But then you're ineffective. At the moment, flip phones, for example, become the thing. I mean, now, first of all, that means you no longer have a smartphone capacity to even use the internet on your phone. So already your social media output has been completely decimated. Something like 80 to 85% of all social media usage is mobile based. I think it might be 90% now. So you're basically already making yourself somewhat politically effective. If you then go on to try to do that at scale, well, then they're simply going to go upstream. They're going to target the institutions. They still have the call records. There's, I would say, be as effective as you can and leverage the pieces that we have. Elon Musk has opened up an entire universe of free speech that wasn't available. Fell out of the sky just a year ago with a $44 billion acquisition. Take this Nashville shooter manifesto, banned on Google, banned on Facebook. Under Jack Dorsey, it would have been banned on Twitter. Now suddenly you can read it. And because it's available on X, that means it can now be covered by the New York Post and covered by Breitbart and covered by Just the News. And, a Titanic can sink with one little hole. And now is not the time for retreating. You've got momentum from 8 different congressional committees, all taking up the anti-censorship mantle. You have a major Supreme Court case currently sitting before a mostly conservative court now, which could result in a huge win in just a couple of weeks. You have a bunch of other class action lawsuits, which are putting a huge amount of pressure. My foundation's website just put up a big piece yesterday on how the censorship industry feels it's on the defensive and can't operate like it could during the 2020 election. Now is the time for moving forward, not backward.
Okay, this is funny. Wells Mortensen, how good of a long-term investment is it to be a stockholder in Q-Tel? In-Q-Tel, I guess.
In-Q-Tel. Yeah, In-Q-Tel is the CIA's venture capital firm. So, look, I mean, the house always wins, right? So, I mean, the joke that I make, and I don't know if that was taken because this is a running joke on my Twitter timeline, but the best thing that you can be as if you are an intelligent investor is to be invested in a company that has the backing of the U.S. federal government's national security agency. So, like, a good example of this, I talk a lot about how the energy industry and the military industry impacts censorship policies. We talked about that with the liquefied natural gas market in Europe earlier and with Germany and whatnot. If you are Chevron and you are trying to invest in the massive shale reserves in eastern Ukraine, the best thing, and it would cost you $100 billion of your own capital to be able to harvest those shale reserves, to be able to produce or have a profit sharing agreement for that gas. You don't have $100 billion of capital laying around. But what if the U.S. federal government does it for you? Essentially, they clear the area, they send in the military contractors. It's the engineering civil affairs teams in Ukraine who set up the oil or the gas rigs to be able to exploit that, because that's what we did from 2013 to 2016. So, when you're an equity investor in a company that taxpayers are paying for in terms of what it takes to produce that product, that's the best game in the house. In-Q-Tel is obviously a special case because, in addition to having the federal government fight for the companies it invests in, you have a permanent partnership between the intelligence agencies, which have powers that they can exercise internationally to protect your international markets, that go well beyond what could even be done by the FTC to protect your investment domestically. So it's a great gig if you can get it, but you got to be early, because In-Q-Tel gets in early.
Okay. But Magpie follows up from the whole smartphone conversation, flip phone, but you can't be manipulated if you're not on it. We need human contact, not virtual, which I do agree with. On the other hand, as somebody who's been kind of on the front lines of interviewing people in this area, how would I have done my job without it? So I don't know. It's kind of like one of those things where you just have to be very responsible with it and just have a lot of like good boundaries, I think, because it can turn you into a terrible parent, for sure. Okay, Cam, Mike, you remind me of Matt Servito when looking at how many hands-off there are with digital content by different content providers, and even Rumble having issues with Steven Crowder leaking Nashville Transshooter Manifesto. Can the corporate industry claim plausible deniability even without Section 230 protection?
Can the corporate industry claim plausible deniability? Is that how it's phrased?
Yeah, corporate industry.
Is he trying to say? Is he trying to say censorship industry? Because corporate industry is maybe maybe it's a bit redundant. That's not exactly a term of art. But and I'm not quite sure what he meant by Rumble having problems with the Nashville Manifesto. Does he mean that Rumble was having problems because advertisers were pulling revenue?
Yeah, good question. Let's see. There are many places between Louder with Crowder Studios and my computer. I don't know what that means. That's his follow-up. I don't know. Well, let me look. Let me see if I'm missing something while we're talking, and maybe I missed something on the whole Rumble thing.
Yeah, so I presume that Rumble, Chris Pavlowski, who runs it, is spectacular.
And we're live there right now.
Mm-hmm. And he's as close to a free speech maximalist as you'll come. So I am absolutely positive that Rumble would not either manually or algorithmically censor the transgender shooter manifesto news cycle.
Steven Crowder, YouTube removed our video exposing this. YouTube is why we streamed to Rumble. Yeah, YouTube
right.
did.
YouTube did, Facebook did, but both X and Rumble have allowed it. So
right, okay.
But that is obviously going to cause them issues as the censorship industry attempts to use their being home to this content as a means to try to economically cripple them by saying advertisers shouldn't advertise on a platform that allows this content. I haven't seen this yet. But I can only imagine that companies like NewsGuard or Check My Ads or Global Disinformation Index or any one of these censorship mercenary firms are going to try to attack Rumble and X for hosting the content.
Okay. The follow-up was that basically Crowder's video had issues like no other Rumble videos did, but the audio was messed up with his. And is it possible that the industry, like the censorship complex, I think this is my interpretation of the question, is messing with, is somehow able to manipulate or mess with this stuff, even, if you're in somebody's free speech platform.
Has Crowder made that allegation? Because there's a lot of
it's just this person. Yeah, no, it's just this person's question.
It could have just been here's another thing: is it could have just been a major stream because it's a major story, And so there's buffering and bandwidth
Mhm.
issues because of all the people who tuned in. I mean, there's a lot of stuff with tech. It's one thing when something's not discoverable, or if something, is clearly not in search when it should be. But tech issues on a video,
Yeah.
I tend to err towards not.
How close are we to losing free speech completely in the United States? And can I ask you, in addition to that, does the Constitution mean anything anymore? I mean, I mean, I know it sounds kind of like silly, but it feels like we're constantly. I mean, this is just me having interviewed many, many, many people who
Yeah.
have lost a job or have been ripped offline or whatever because of what they've said. And not just like working for private, but for the government. I mean, me personally, I was fired by my government job for this podcast because they didn't like the people that I was interviewing. Even though I said I had a constitutional right to talk to whoever I wanted to in my free time, but I have to now pay somebody, or maybe someone takes my case. Like I have to then write the situation instead of them just following what I thought was the Constitution.
Right.
And it just seems like a really upside down world. Does the Constitution only matter if you have a government that follows it or a judicial system that's willing to enforce? I mean, what good is the Constitution? Dr. Rennie Moon, who was just on here a week ago, was talking about her parents, her mom specifically growing up in a communist country. And I asked that same question. She said they had a constitution. Because I said, well, what about us? We have a constitution.
Yeah,
She's like,
right.
well, they had a constitution too.
Right.
Nobody
Yeah.
followed it.
Right, exactly. Well, we're about to find out. Right now, the Missouri v. Biden case is
Which one
currently.
of my videos is in?
Oh, that's
One of my videos
awesome.
is in
That's
that case.
great.
Yeah, because that was one of the videos I got fired over, was Dr. Aaron Cariotti. It was like I had him on my
Yeah.
show and he was ripped off by YouTube. And then my
Yeah.
bosses told me to stop talking to people like him. I refused.
Yeah.
And then they fired me from the State Department of Natural Resources, which doesn't even have anything to do with health and
Right.
COVID. But anyway.
Right. But State
But
Department
yeah,
was leaving the censor. Yeah, I mean, that's.
yeah. So, but yeah, I mean, it's just you say though, like that doesn't even, I mean, it's just crazy to think about. It was been a couple of years now, but like, yeah, I guess you're right. We'll see with that case, but I just think back to it because, it takes years, I mean, think of all the people in the meantime, since that video that he and I did, that's now in this case, it's working as, that's at the Supreme Court. It just like every single one of those people now has to go back and sue, or, I mean, how their lives have been changed over years. It's like, we don't even find out if it was legal or not until after our lives have been totally upended. We've moved on. You know what I mean? It's kind of like how the VA works with veterans. They're like, pre-existing condition. And then you move on. And it's like, oh, okay, now Agent Orange. Now that Vietnam,
Right.
it's like decades in the past, we'll say
Right.
Agent Orange was a bad thing. Anyway, sorry, I just had to put it on.
No, I mean, well, so there's two things. The Supreme Court is ultimately going to, what it says is going to reverberate for a generation. I mean, this really is the biggest free speech case in 50 years, at least. I mean, Brandenburg versus Ohio, which is basically what established, your bill. I mean, which kind of ratified, in the late 70s, our constitutional rights that had, frankly, not even really kind of existed for a lot of the 20th century. There were a lot of sort of speech controls that were rolled back, but frankly, with Brandenburg. But this is for the digital age, and I do expect quite a favorable ruling there. I'm not sure we'll get everything that we want or that we deserve, but I'm confident we will get something fairly strong out of a conservative majority on the court. But there was an incredible sweeping July 4th trial court order that basically banned the government from doing all of this stuff. I mean, it was incredible, but then it was sort of partially overturned on appeal. So now we'll see where SCOTUS falls on it. But larger than that, there is now a discussion, which I never thought I'd see in this country, or at least not until a couple of years ago, when it started to become evident this was happening, where the concept of a First Amendment is losing legitimacy at the highest levels of elite institutional power in our country. I'll give you a great example from the State Department. The inner censorship sanctum of the State Department is a little place called the Global Engagement Center, which was initially set up to censor speech by foreign extremist groups like ISIS, so that the State Department could work with Facebook and Google and Twitter to stop ISIS recruiting. So they mapped the language, the major accounts, yada, yada. Then after the 2016 election, when they made the argument that Trump supporters were all Russian assets, the Global Engagement Center turned inward and basically focused on censoring Americans. Now, the guy who set up the Global Engagement Center is an incredibly notorious, I mean, shocking. His arc from free speech, hero to villain, if you will, is kind of amazing. He's the Rick Stengel is his name. He was the managing editor of Time Magazine. Now, Time Magazine was a major CIA conduit for the entire 20th century. It was one of the biggest receipts in the entire Operation Mockingbird. So it's not really a surprise that he ended up being the Undersecretary of State, basically number 3 at the State Department for the Obama administration. He described himself as Obama's propagandist in chief. And from 2012 to 2016, he described his job as exporting the First Amendment around the world. Because again, like I laid out earlier, what the State Department and the CIA and the Pentagon do is we say other countries need free speech. That way, our CIA and our State Department can work with political opposition groups and dissident groups to be able to overthrow their governments or destabilize their governments or install our own favorable governments by building up a giant media funnel and political funnel for the groups we want to win abroad. So we export the First Amendment so that we can build a robust, basically, set of proxy political parties internationally. So that was Rick Stengel, free speech maximalist from 2012 to 2016. Trump wins the election. He leaves the State Department. He then writes a book and an op-ed in the Washington Post about the need to end the First Amendment and for the U.S. to move to a European-style sort of blurry, fuzzy, no hard lines kind of thing. Something should be illegal speech when you see it, sort of thing. He started promoting that the moment they lost that election. Basically, when the Trump election happened, everything about our Constitution changed. What you sort of see as the upshot of that is the Constitution kind of served these stakeholders, and it was protected because it served a useful function. Once that functionality stopped serving them so aggressively, they stopped protecting it so aggressively. And in fact, a growing component of them have started lobbying for a new constitutional social contract. Chris Krebs, the guy who ran the DHS CISA sub-agency, has said the same thing. Francis Fukuyama from the State Department, trustee of the Rand Corporation Council on Foreign Relations, the guy who wrote the end of history doctrine for the Cold War, has said the same thing. You have major intelligence, statecraft, military, and essentially major figures in American politics and institutional influence who are, I won't call it a consensus yet. It's still quite a ways from a consensus, but they are in the middle of a consensus building process to end the First Amendment. And whether if they get there, then this country will look very different a few years from now.
That is really fascinating. I've never heard anybody say that, but it really makes a lot of sense, and that's it. Yeah, it's fascinating in a bad way. Okay, let me show everybody your foundation again. Foundation for Freedom Online. You can go check everything out there, and it's just foundationforfreedomonline.com. Mike, I did have one other question. I remember the reason I saw you on Twitter was because I think it was back when the EU was coming after Elon Musk related to the Israel-Hamas war, and saying that he was going to have to tell him what he was doing about misinformation or something. And then, recently he's basically said that now you're going to be demonetized if Community Notes checks you. Not really something that I was happy to see him do. I'm not sure what you thought. Can I just throw that question at you? What was originally the tweet that you said, "Hey, Elon, this is why they're coming after me. This is what, can you explain why that was, what you were trying to explain? And then also, what do you think about his move to use Community Notes is that to make them happy? What was the point of that?
Yeah. So, I mean, the EU passed this new thing called the Digital Services Act. you have to remember the EU is basically the underarm of NATO. NATO is the Western military alliance. The EU played a huge part in U.S. internet censorship because, as I mentioned, there's this sort of domino where in the 2016 election, when Trump won and when Brexit happened, they were afraid that Brexit was going to happen in France, Grexit was going to happen in Greece, Grexit was going to happen in Germany, Italexit would happen in Italy, Spexit would happen in Spain. The whole EU would come undone, which meant the entire commercial enterprise of a common currency, a common trade market would all fall apart. That would mean IMF would be would be undermined. It would mean NATO would fall apart because the commercial interlinkages basically uphold the military interlinkages. So you had this focus by the EU on controlling political speech in all the different EU countries to stop political populist parties who were against the foreign policy establishment, who were against NATO, who were against the State Department, to stop them from rising from power, because they all were relying on the internet and social media to win elections, because none of these people had the support of broadcast TV in their countries. It was like the Trump election. There was not a single mainstream media endorsement for Trump. There was not a single newspaper, not even the New York Post or the Murdoch magazines came out and endorsed Trump for president in 2016. They did in 2020 after he had a little bit more institutional sort of concessions to mainstream republicanism. But it's the same thing in Europe. But they were winning elections and parliamentary elections because of the internet. So the EU basically created this Digital Services Act and this disinformation compliance component to stop parties from rising to power who could challenge EU political orthodoxy. And if X is allowed to have free speech in the EU, then there goes 7 years of systematic censorship architecture meticulously constructed by those same regulatory officials. So they are now coming after Musk so that Musk can be a good little boy just like Jack Dorsey was. And they're using a variety of organs to do that are probably outside the scope of this conversation. But to circle back to the community notes question, the censorship industry is myopically focused on revenue flow to content creators, revenue flow to alternative news institutions, because they understand that money is what dictates influence. The more money people make from producing alternative news content, the more distribution get, the more capacities they have. They've got better production quality, then they can hire more people, they can then produce more content, they can have higher distribution. So they've engaged in a philosophy of capacity crippling, which is why they go after, for example, the first thing they went after with Elon was going after the revenue on the platform from third-party advertisers. The ADL went after them in an ad boycott. State Department-funded NGOs went after them in ad boycotts. NewsGuard and Check My Ads and CCDH, Center for Countering Digital Hate, went after them with ad boycotts. They want to kill the ability to make money from producing dissident content, because once it's attached to that commercial wheel of enterprise, it hits the moon and goes on steroids. So this, what's happening with the community notes thing, I'm not privy to any insider conversations there. Even if I was, I wouldn't say it. So I can only speculate in an effort to try to be helpful. What I'd offer is that the platform, I suspect, is under a tremendous amount of pressure from outside regulators, both in the DNC controlled Senate and the DNC controlled executive branch, and on the European regulator side. And so them being able to hold up and say, hey, you wanted us to demonetize Russell Brand. We didn't do that. But what we did do is we adjusted our community note thing so that if there is a validated fact check on a single post, it won't demonetize you as an account, so that people can still make a living on X. But if a particular post is fact check false, then it will demonetize that single one. That's something I think that the Solomon's baby, and again, I'm totally speculating here, I could be 100% wrong. I suspect that this is a sort of Solomon's, King Solomon split the baby situation, where they know that this, unless it's really weaponized, and they said they'll provide the code to make sure it won't be weaponized, it won't materially impact people's salaries, because only a very, very, very tiny fraction of what you post gets community noted. There's not even the scale to community note everything. So the accounts will still be monetized. So it's something that will be sort of non-material in terms of hurting creators, but will be something that can be held up to signal at compliance to regulators that they are not monetizing misinformation. I don't like it, just like I'm sure you don't, but I also accept the political practicalities and necessities of running a large business in the face of governments who want to kill you. So I can't really judge at this point that to be a bad business, political, or even ideological decision until it really becomes a problem.
Okay, well, that's an interesting explanation I had not thought of before. Okay, so you're saying maybe he's trying to keep Twitter alive in Europe, doing the least amount of possible damage to creators on the platform.
Yes, and I would also broaden that beyond he, because Linda Yaccarino and her team are, I think, the ones principally interfacing. And there may be things that, but yes, that's the gist of it. Yes.
Okay. Did you want to talk about her? Because I'm curious if you know anything. We were also a little nervous, I think, on my end of the viewer show, dark side of the internet, I guess, about her and what her influence is going to be, because she used to work for NBC News, and we're like, how's this going to work out?
Worse than NBC News, she was the head of advertiser relations for the World Economic Forum.
Oh, right. That's what it was. Okay, that's what it was.
And she was hired just 3 months after Elon Musk called the World Economic Forum basically, the puppeteering strings of the evil empire. So, there was a funny thing there. What I'll say is the biggest concerns I had around Linda Yaccarino, because of her background at the World Economic Forum, building up a squad, so to speak, of censorship operatives. Elon Musk did an incredibly bold thing that drew the ire and a huge media backlash from all the major mainstream corporations, as well as the U.S. federal government, and as well as all their intelligence agency proxies, when he fired a guy named Aaron Rodrigues and his whole election integrity team. This is basically the election censorship team, who was part of that same CIA affiliated, State Department affiliated censorship network in Twitter 1.0. My fears initially around Linda Yaccarino were that, because the World Economic Forum is closely tied to BlackRock. BlackRock's very closely tied to the intelligence services. There's a fear that it's all one big party and, you're not invited, sort of thing. But the fact is you pretty much, as soon as, now I'm not privy to anything inside, and again, I wouldn't say it even if I was, but it did not take a lot of time for for Twitter, for X to be apprised of the election integrity team's rogue censorship status, for them to act on it, axe the whole team, and basically get rid of this whole rogue cell. Now, that's the sort of thing that I don't know who's in charge of that, whether that's Musk or Yaccarino, but whoever it is, however their tag team is working, it seems to be working beautifully. And I'm extremely. I was very skeptical, and I still hold reservations. I have been very impressed with how they've sailed the ship so far, and they certainly have my support to date.
Somebody was asking why you got out of government. Was it just because you were working on the Trump administration and they're no longer the Trump administration? Is that, or did you?
Yeah, I was a political appointee. I wasn't fired, but it's customary as sometimes political appointees stay over. That's not, it's rare, but it does happen from time to time. But it didn't seem like, given that I was a free speech advocate out of my position, and it was very apparent that the next administration would not want someone like that in that role, I simply, resigned, when the administration turned over, which is standard courtesy, if you will, for political appointees.
Do you think he would go back if he wins? Do you think it would?
It's tough to say, it was in one respect, I think it's kind of the coolest job in the world. On the other hand, you actually have a lot more flexibility to do things on the outside than you do on the inside. And, it's so hard to predict what the world's going to look like in November. I mean, frankly, even if Trump wins, the stuff they're going to do to I don't know. That's something where I would be honored to have my name in the hat for certain positions at the State Department. It would be a family decision sort of thing. They really they try to kill you in there. I mean, I don't mean that literally, but there's with what's happening right now with the Justice Department. Um, I mean, we don't know if we're even going to have a. I mean, if you're going to be physically safe in DC, if they're going to unleash the anarcho tyranny, sort of Antifa, BLM mobs, I mean, there were times even working at the White House where it felt unsafe even going to work. You can imagine how that might be worse with a Trump administration in the current climate. It's
Do you
tough,
think Antifa has connections to the government? I have people, because I use the video that like put me on the map on YouTube was about covering Antifa in
Yeah.
Seattle. I think I was very naive about them, even when I did that video, even though I was covering, every May Day, it's like all these people are running amok in Seattle. But I've had people make comments about government connection of some kind, infiltration or something like that. What are your thoughts on that? And then I promise I'll let you go.
Yeah, sure. So, and again, this is a casual conversation. I never like to be over my skis or to say
Yeah.
something that I can't back up with receipts. So, I find this to be an interesting topic. And, in the interest of just kind of trying to be responsive, I don't have a fully formed opinion on this. I can't prove what my suspicions are. So I'm not asserting any of this as fact. But yeah, I do think that's the case, and I've got, I think, educated guess reasons, even if I don't have hard forensic receipts on it. I mean, first of all, you know that the intelligence agencies work with Antifa abroad. This is not me speculating. If you look up the Kurdish Antifa units and the Kurds are a CIA-backed proxy group. Now, look, you can make the same argument that the CIA supports Nazis, right? I mean, the Azov Battalion, right sector in Ukraine. That doesn't mean that that doesn't mean that that the CIA is backing Patriot Front or something like that. And I'm not even casting aspersions. That's just the first association that came to mind. I don't even know anything about that group. I'm just trying to think of a corollary for what folks might say about the inverse of Antifa. So just because the CIA works with Antifa abroad doesn't mean they work with them here. But what I will say is, I was in the White House when those riots broke out in the summer of 2020. And what I saw there shook my in terms of, we're huddled in here at 17th and State Street in the friggin', Pennsylvania Avenue, basically, on one corner, State Street on the other, and you're surrounded. I had to hug a Secret Service agent one day to get out of it was almost like Lion King with the gazelle. Like I was like little Simba getting stampeded. Working personally for the president of the United States. At the time, I had a loved one on the phone who thought I'd been killed because they knocked the phone out of my hand and all that stuff. That's something. Everybody who tried to get to work at the White House felt that, like, am I going to die today trying to get to work? Now that only lasted for about 5 or 6 days. There was a lot more low intensity stuff for the rest of the summer. But there were conversations, with the FBI and what was being done to actually address this. And what I'll say is, it was very, very spooky that that our own law enforcement agencies and our own domestic intelligence agencies, who exist for the purpose of basically stopping organized violence, were so non-responsive and so deliberately stonewalling direct inquiries from the White House itself. It really did truly feel like they were sponsored groups at the time. And there's a lot more to say on that, but maybe that's a conversation for another time.
Well, that was more than I thought you were going to say. So that was interesting. I mean, I honestly, the first time I ever saw somebody write that, I was like, huh? I don't know. I had never thought about that before.
The other thing that I'll say, by the way, is, you mentioned the Seattle connections, also Portland also DC. These are all places, Philly, all of the major places where these Antifa cells did the worst were all places with Soros DAs, and Soros is just I mean, Soros. I did a whole 9-minute video. You can, if you just go to my Twitter handle at Mike Ben Cyber and you type in Soros, Reagan, and CIA, and you'll just put that all in, and it'll turn up a 9-minute video, and it goes through Soros's whole history with the intelligence services, the State Department, and NATO. He basically builds his whole investment portfolio, drafting off what he knows that the government is going to do, because his organization, the Open Society Foundation, works as a cutout in Central and Eastern Europe, in Southeast Asia, in Latin America, around the world for that. They're paid by him as well. The DAs are paid by him. And at the end of the day, these rioting groups got payouts for what they did. Multi-million-dollar payouts in Seattle, in Portland, in Philadelphia, whereas January 6th rioters all got, 10, 20 years in prison. Their rioters actually got paid. Now, I suspect they got paid beyond just the prosecutorial payouts, because they belong to these AFL-CIO type unions. They were, a lot of the mass congregates from these civil society foundations like Open Society and like these crisis action networks. But no, I suspect that what you basically have there is a kind of domestic destabilization force that can be essentially rolled out of the box to be able to create pressure on a federal on an executive branch who is not doing what the you might call sort of the deeper uniparty would like it to do. I think they unleashed on Trump in 2020. I think it'll be back in 2024.
Okay, and I'm glad you brought up your Twitter, because yes, everybody can go follow you there. Mike Benz Cyber. Mike, thanks for doing this and taking the time. Really appreciate it. Thanks for rolling with the 1-year-old. And any final thoughts, or what do you have?
No, it's been a great conversation. Probably something simple. I'm on the road, so I don't know. But thank you. This is a great conversation. Best of luck to you. You're doing really brave, courageous work, and thanks to your audience for tuning in.
Everybody, see you next time.